The summer dust lay heavy on the town of Willow Creek that day, clinging to boots and horses alike, curling in the air like memory and regret. It was the day the sheriff announced that the new rancher in town, a quiet man known only as Colt Avery, would be allowed to choose a bride. It was meant to be a show of hospitality, or perhaps a cruel kind of entertainment. The war had taken too many men. The land needed rebuilding. Women waited, widowed or abandoned, their hope drying like the riverbeds. So the sheriff, boisterous and red-faced from whiskey and self-importance, had stood outside the saloon and shouted, "Choose any woman you want, cowboy. Any one of 'em will make a fine wife." The townsfolk had laughed, the women blushed and giggled, and the men nudged each other, their eyes sly with envy or mockery. But Colt hadn't laughed. He'd simply lifted his gaze from under the brim of his hat, his jaw shadowed by dust and silence, and looked through the crowd as if searching for something or someone none of them could see. He was not like the others. His silence unsettled people. He carried his grief like a second skin, worn thin but never shed. No one knew where he came from, only that his horse limped slightly, his hands bore old scars, and his eyes held the kind of sorrow that made people step back without knowing why. The sheriff had thought to make sport of him, some fun for the town. After all, Willow Creek thrived on small cruelties. Gossip was its blood, but as Colt dismounted, the laughter died for a heartbeat. There was something in the way he moved, careful, deliberate, as if every step was a prayer or a wound reopened. The women gathered near the edge of the square, pretending not to hope, though their eyes darted toward him with timid curiosity. They were all shapes of loneliness, young widows, tired mothers, girls with hands calloused from scrubbing and sewing. But behind them, in the shadow of the livery stable, stood Mary Bell, the girl everyone avoided. She was 23, but carried herself like she had lived twice as long. Her body was large, soft in all the ways this harsh land punished, and her clothes strained at the seams. She wore her hair in a braid that always came loose by day's end, and her face, round and pale, flushed easily beneath the sun. The townsfolk called her Mary Cow behind her back, though there was no mirth in it. Her father, once a drunk ranch hand, had died 2 winters before, leaving her alone in a cabin at the edge of town. She worked washing clothes for pennies, her hands cracked and red from lye and cold water. Still, she sang softly to herself as she worked, hymns and old ballads about love that never came. That morning she had only come into town to trade soap and flour. She didn't expect to be noticed. She never was. When the sheriff's words reached her ears, she smiled bitterly, tugging at her shawl. "Choose any woman you want," she whispered, shaking her head. She knew what kind of women men wanted. Slim ones, graceful ones, the kind that turned heads. Not her, never her. So she turned to leave, clutching her bundle, when a hush fell over the crowd again. She didn't know that Colt's eyes had found her. He hadn't meant to look at her. He'd scanned the crowd without thinking, his heart already weary of the spectacle. But then he saw her, standing apart, trying to disappear, and something inside him shifted. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't trying to be chosen. Her eyes, gray and soft, looked like they'd seen too many winters and not enough kindness. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself once in a burned-out farmhouse where no one came back for him. And for a moment the world narrowed. The heat, the murmurs, the sheriff's smug grin, and there was only her. The heavy girl who flinched when people spoke her name. "Go on, cowboy," the sheriff taunted, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Don't be shy now. Pick yourself a fine lady. We got plenty eager to start a new life." Colt's voice was low when he finally spoke. "That one," he said, tipping his hat toward the livery's shadow. Laughter erupted like thunder. Men slapped their knees. Women gasped. Someone shouted, "The fat one? You can't be serious." Another said, "Must be a joke, no man with eyes would choose her." But Colt didn't flinch. His gaze stayed steady, unreadable. The sheriff blinked, his grin faltering. "You mean Mary Bell?" he asked, almost hoping for correction. That girl?" Colt nodded once. Her. The world seemed to tilt then. Mary froze, her breath catching. Heat rushed to her face, shame biting deeper than the noon sun. She wanted to vanish, to run until her lungs gave out. They were laughing again, harder this time, crueler. "Go on, Mary," someone called. "You got yourself a husband." But Colt's expression didn't change. He stepped toward her slowly, hat in hand, as if approaching something fragile. "Monsieur," he said softly, his voice carrying over the crowd, steady as a prayer. "Would you do me the honor of letting me call you wife?" She couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but only tears came. The sheriff, sensing the moment slipping from mockery into something he didn't understand, barked a forced laugh. Well, there you have it. Guess the cowboy's got his taste. Ain't my place to argue with love, even when it's blind. The people hooted and jeered, some pretending to clap. But Colt ignored them. He reached for her trembling hands, rough from work, and held them gently as though she were made of glass. Don't mind them, he murmured, his voice almost lost in the noise. They don't see what I see. Her knees nearly buckled. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not once. The world blurred behind tears, and she whispered, barely audible, "Why me?" He hesitated, just long enough for the silence to burn. "Because you're the only one here who isn't pretending," he said. Then, without another word, he led her through the crowd, past their laughter and disbelief toward his waiting horse. And though her heart hammered with fear and confusion, for the first time in years she didn't lower her eyes. Behind them, the sheriff muttered something about madness and pity. But Colt didn't care. The town of Willow Creek faded behind him like a bad dream. Ahead lay the open plains, a storm rolling in the distance, and a woman beside him who had never once been chosen, until now. The road out of Willow Creek wound through the wild golden hills, empty and aching beneath the lowering sky. The laughter from town still echoed faintly in Mary's ears long after it was gone, a phantom chorus she couldn't shake. She rode side saddle behind Colt, clutching the worn leather of his coat, her body trembling with every jolt of the horse. Her heart thudded painfully, torn between disbelief and humiliation. The wind stung her eyes, but it couldn't wash away the memory of their cruel faces. The way their laughter cut through her like a knife. Why did he do it? She thought again and again. Why me, of all people? Was it pity? Some twisted joke he's playing along with? She dared to look up once at his back, broad, steady, unmoving, and wondered if he could feel her shame pressing against him like a weight. He hadn't spoken since they left town. Only the creak of the saddle, the steady rhythm of hooves, and the whisper of wind through the dry grass filled the silence. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, she whispered, "You didn't have to do that." Her voice was so small it nearly broke. He didn't turn. For a long while she thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then his voice came low and distant like thunder from far away. "I don't do things I don't mean, ma'am." The words made her chest tighten. Ma'am. Not Mary, not Miss Bell, just that polite, unreachable word that kept her at arm's length. She bit her lip and looked down, watching her skirt twist in the wind. "They were laughing at you," she said bitterly. "At both of us." "I noticed," he replied simply. She wanted him to be angry, to explain, to give her something solid to hold on to. But his calm only deepened the ache in her. She didn't understand him. He seemed carved from silence itself, his shoulders straight, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. Every now and then she caught a glimpse of his eyes when he glanced toward the horizon, gray, like rain clouds that never broke. There was sadness in them, yes, but not the kind that begged for sympathy. It was the kind that came from living through something too heavy to ever name. By dusk, the plains opened into a valley of dark pine and wind-swept rock. A small cabin stood there, weathered and alone, its roof patched with tin, a single lantern glowing faintly inside. Mary felt her stomach twist. This is it, she thought. This is where he'll leave me, or where I'll find out what kind of man he really is. Colt swung off the horse, tied the reins, and turned to help her down. His hands, rough and scarred, were unexpectedly gentle. "Careful," he murmured as she slid to the ground. Her feet sank into the soft earth, her legs unsteady after the long ride. She stumbled, and he caught her by the arm, not hard, just enough to steady her. For a moment their eyes met. She looked away first. The air smelled of pine and rain. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the ridge. Colt opened the cabin door and motioned for her to enter. "It ain't much," he said quietly, "but it's dry, and it's home." Inside, the room was small but neat. A cot in the corner, a wooden table, a stove, and shelves lined with jars of beans, flour, and dried herbs. Everything was plain but cared for. It felt lived in, though lonely. She stood in the middle of it, clutching her shawl, uncertain what to do. "I can sleep by the fire," she said quickly, afraid he might expect something else. He shook his head. "You'll take the bed. I'll take the floor," she blinked. "That's not right." He met her gaze then, his expression unreadable. "I didn't bring you here to hurt you, Mary." It was the first time he'd said her name, and it stopped her breath cold. Tears pricked at her eyes again. tears she'd fought all day. "Then why did you bring me here?" she asked in a trembling voice. "You could have had anyone. They would have fallen over themselves to marry you. But you chose me, the one they laugh at. I need to know why." He turned away, his jaw tightening. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the shutters. Then softly he said, "Because I know what it's like to be laughed at." Mary frowned, startled. "I know what it's like," he continued, "to walk into a room and see the looks on their faces, to hear them whisper when they think you can't, to feel like you're made wrong somehow." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, old, torn at the edges. "I fought in the war," he said. "Took a bullet through the shoulder that never healed right. Lost most of what I owned. Came back to a woman who'd promised to wait for me. She didn't. Said I'd changed. Said I made her sick to look at. So I left." The words fell heavy in the room. Mary felt her throat close. She had imagined his silence was born of pride or coldness, but now she saw something else. Hurt buried deep. Too deep for pity. He set the paper on the table. It was a faded photograph, him and a woman, her hand on his chest, smiling. He didn't look at it. "I don't need someone to make me look good in front of others," he said. "I just need someone honest." He turned then, his eyes finding hers. "And you don't hide who you are, Mary. They may laugh, but you stand there and take it. You don't spit back, you don't play their games. That takes more strength than any of them will ever understand." Her tears spilled freely now. "You don't know me," she whispered. He gave a faint, sad smile. "Maybe not yet, but I'd like to." The words hung between them, fragile as glass. For a moment she almost believed him, almost allowed herself to feel the warmth of something she hadn't known in years. But then the echo of laughter came back to her, sharp and cruel, and she flinched. "They'll never let us forget," she said bitterly. "Every time we go to town, they'll look at me and think you're a fool." Colt stepped closer, slow and careful, as if afraid to scare her off. "Let them," he said. "I stopped living for other people a long time ago." The thunder rolled again, closer now, shaking the walls. He lit the lantern, casting soft light across his face. For the first time, she saw how tired he really was, the lines around his eyes, the quiet pain that never left him. And in that moment, something in her broke. Not from hurt, but from understanding. She turned away, wiping her tears, and whispered, "I'll make you supper." He didn't stop her. Didn't thank her either. He just watched as she moved about the small kitchen, awkward and trembling, her hands still shaking as she lit the stove. Outside, the storm began to fall, steady and cold, and the two of them, broken in different ways, shared the silence of the cabin, the air between them thick with all the things neither knew how to say yet. The next morning dawned gray and wet, the storm's remnants still whispering across the valley. Mary woke to the sound of roosters and rain dripping from the eaves, the scent of damp pine heavy in the air. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the ache in her arms and the faint stiffness in her back reminded her. She was no longer in her small cabin by the creek, but here in Colt Avery's home, the man who had married her in front of a laughing town. She sat up slowly, clutching the thin blanket around her, and stared at the small room glowing with the first hint of daylight. It felt too quiet, too still, as though she were trespassing in a dream that wasn't hers. Colt was already gone. She found his note on the table, just a few words scrawled in a steady hand. Gone to check fences. Coffee's ready. Be back by noon. She read it twice, uncertain whether to smile or cry. No one had ever left her a note before. No one had ever thought she might care where they were. The day passed in nervous energy. She cleaned what didn't need cleaning, polished the old kettle until her fingers cramped, swept the floor 3 times. The place was neat already. Colt kept it that way, but she couldn't bear to sit still. Her thoughts chased themselves in circles. What if he regrets it? What if he wakes up and realizes what a fool he's been? She tried to push the doubt away, but it clung like burrs to her heart. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. She moved to the small window and looked out toward the hills. Somewhere out there, he was working in the mud and rain. His coat dark with water, his hat pulled low. She felt something stir in her chest, a strange protective ache she hadn't known before. When he finally returned, soaked and silent, she met him at the door with a towel and awkward concern. He mumbled thanks, his eyes soft with gratitude, and went to change. It was such a small thing, but it filled her with warmth. Maybe, she thought, she could make herself useful. Maybe if she worked hard enough, she could deserve this place, deserve him. The days became a rhythm. Colt rose before dawn, worked the fences and cattle, repaired the barn roof, mended tools. Mary kept the fire burning, cooked, cleaned, mended shirts. Her hands blistered and bled, but she didn't stop. She learned how to churn butter, how to smoke meat, how to patch leather. Each small task became a prayer. Let him see I'm trying, let him see I can belong here. And slowly she began to see the cabin not as his home but theirs. She planted a few wildflowers by the porch. She hummed while she worked. The silence no longer frightened her, but the peace never lasted long when she went into town. The first time she did, 2 weeks later, she carried a basket of eggs and butter to trade. Colt had offered to go with her, but she refused. "They'll only laugh worse if you're beside me," she said quietly. He'd frowned, but he didn't argue. He only said, "Hold your head up, Mary. They can't touch what you don't give them." She tried. God help her, she tried. But the moment she stepped into the general store, the whispers began. "Well, look who's come to town," someone said near the flour barrels. "Mrs. Avery, isn't it?" "Guess miracles do happen," another voice laughed. "More like charity." Mary kept her eyes on the counter, her face burning. She paid for her sugar and soap, thanked the clerk, and left as quickly as she could. But the words followed her like shadows: charity, miracle, pity. She walked home in tears, her basket clutched tight, shame burning deeper than the sun. When Colt returned that evening, he found her outside, kneeling by the porch steps, scrubbing mud from the boards that didn't need scrubbing. Her eyes were red. He stopped beside her, silent for a long time, then crouched down. "They said something," he murmured. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to speak. "What did they say?" "Nothing worth repeating," she whispered. He was quiet for a while, then said softly, "Don't let them turn you into what they already believe." She looked up at him, startled. "What does that mean?" He met her gaze steadily. "They want to see you break. It's how small people feel big. Don't give them the satisfaction." His calmness made her cry harder. "You don't understand," she choked. "They'll never stop. They think you only married me to be kind or to mock them back. You deserve better than this." Colt's jaw tightened. "I don't care what they think," but she shook her head fiercely. "I do, because every time I go there they make me feel like I'm dragging you down, like I'm a burden you have to carry." He stood then, looking out toward the hills. His voice, when it came, was low and pained. "Mary, you're not a burden. You never were." She wanted to believe him, but the laughter from town still rang in her ears. "Then why do I still feel like one?" she whispered. That night she couldn't sleep. The rain started again, soft against the roof, and she lay awake listening to it, feeling the weight of her body against the bed, heavy and unwanted. She thought of the women in town, slim, graceful, with eyes full of pity or contempt, and her throat tightened. She would never be like them. No amount of work could change that. But when she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamt of Colt's voice saying, "Don't let them turn you into what they already believe." The next morning, she woke with a strange resolve. If she couldn't be beautiful, she would be strong. She rose early before dawn and followed Colt to the pasture. He tried to stop her at first, but she insisted. She helped carry feed, fetched tools, even mended fence wire with bleeding hands. He watched her quietly, never saying much, but something in his gaze softened with every passing day. When she stumbled, he reached out without thinking. When she cursed under her breath, he smiled faintly. By evening, they worked side by side, two souls scarred by ridicule, bound by a quiet defiance, and when weeks later, the town needed a hand with the cattle drive and the sheriff sneered. "Maybe your wife can watch from the porch," Colt said coldly. "She'll ride beside me." And she did. It was hard, brutal work. Her arms ached, her legs bruised, and the sun burned her skin raw. But when she saw the look on their faces, those same men who'd once laughed at her, when she rode past them upright in the saddle, her husband at her side, something inside her cracked open. Not pride exactly, but something stronger. Worth. For the first time in her life, she felt it pulse in her chest. That night, as they sat by the fire, too tired to speak, Colt glanced at her blistered hands and murmured, "They'll stop laughing soon." Mary smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I don't care if they do," she said. "Not anymore." And in the quiet that followed, the two of them watched the flames dance, the night wind carrying away the last of the laughter that once haunted her. The summer rolled into heat and dust again, the kind that baked the earth until even the wind seemed tired. By then, Mary had learned every creak and sigh of the ranch. The way the old porch moaned at night, the smell of hay before rain, the quiet rhythm of Colt's breathing beside the fire. She no longer flinched when he reached for something near her, no longer felt the same burning need to apologize for her existence. He had a way of looking at her that stilled the noise inside her head. But peace, as she'd learned too often, never lasted long in Willow Creek. It started with whispers again. People in town didn't like what they couldn't understand. When they saw her riding beside Colt during the cattle drive, when they heard she was fixing fences, tending animals, cooking for the ranch hands, they laughed less openly but with sharper tongues. Envy, cruelty, jealousy, it all mixed together like poison in a well. And in small towns like Willow Creek, poison had a way of spreading fast. One afternoon, Colt had to ride into town for supplies. Mary insisted on coming. She said she needed to buy fabric for curtains, but really she just wanted to show she wasn't afraid. She braided her hair neatly, wore her cleanest dress, and tried to hold her head high. Colt noticed the way she kept tugging at her sleeves, the nervous flutter of her hands, but he didn't say a word. He only offered his arm when they dismounted, and she took it, hesitant, unsure if she deserved to. The general store was crowded. Men and women turned as they entered, conversation dipping for just a breath before resuming. Colt went to the counter to order feed and nails while Mary walked toward the bolts of cloth near the back. She was trying to decide between a pale blue and a faded rose pattern when she heard it. The snicker, low but sharp. "Well, I'll be," said a woman's voice she recognized, Clara Jenkins, the sheriff's sister-in-law, with a tongue as poisonous as a rattler's. "Looks like Mr. Avery finally brought his charity case to town," another voice chimed in, softer, but no less cruel. "Poor thing probably thinks a new dress will make her less substantial." Laughter followed. Mary froze, her hands trembling over the fabric. She wanted to melt into the floor, to disappear. She thought of Colt just a few steps away and prayed he hadn't heard. But the sound of boots behind her told her he had. Colt's voice cut through the murmurs, calm, low, but edged with steel. "You got something worth saying. Say it to me." The store went silent. Clara caught mid-laugh, blinked, and tried to recover her composure. "Now, Mr. Avery, I didn't mean any offense." "We were just talking about my wife," he interrupted, "so go on. Finish what you were saying." Color drained from her face. "It was just a joke. Ain't funny," Colt said flatly. "Not now. Not ever." No one dared to speak. The clerk busied himself stacking cans, pretending not to hear. Mary's throat burned with humiliation and gratitude and fear all tangled together. She wanted him to stop, to walk away, but she also wanted the whole town to hear him, to hear that word again. Wife. He turned to her then, his expression softening. "Get what you came for, Mary." She nodded, unable to speak. Her hands still shook as she chose the blue fabric and paid for it. But when she looked up again, Colt was still standing tall beside her, his presence solid as the mountains. The town might mock, but for once she didn't feel small. That moment, though, came with a cost. By evening, half the town had heard the story, and by morning it had twisted. Some said Colt had threatened the sheriff's kin. Others said he'd cursed them both. The whispers grew until they became open contempt. The next Sunday, when Mary walked into the small church alone, Colt had stayed home to fix the fence. She felt the weight of every stare. The preacher's sermon on humility and sin felt aimed squarely at her. When it ended, few offered her a greeting. Outside, as she stepped down the dusty steps, Clara stood waiting with two other women. "Didn't see your husband today," Clara said sweetly. "Guess he's too good for church now." Mary swallowed hard. "He's working." Clara smiled like a cat with cream. "Or maybe he realized some folks don't belong here." "A woman should know her place, Mrs. Avery." Mary's hands tightened on her Bible. For the first time, something hot and fierce rose in her chest. She met Clara's gaze steadily. "You're right," she said. "A woman should know her place. Mine's beside my husband." Then she turned and walked away before the tears could fall. That night, when Colt came in from the fields, she was sitting on the porch, the sunset burning gold behind her. He saw the tightness in her jaw and the faint bruise where someone's elbow had accidentally caught her in church. His hands clenched at his sides. "Who?" he asked. She shook her head. "Doesn't matter. The hell it doesn't. She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with pain. "If you fight them, Colt, they'll just hate us more." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "Let them hate me. I can take it. And me?" she asked softly. "Can I?" The question stopped him cold. He knelt down beside her, his hands hovering near hers. "Mary," he said, his voice breaking just a little, "you shouldn't have to be strong all the time. Not for me, not for them. You just be you. That's enough." Her breath hitched. "But it's not enough for the world." He lifted her chin gently. "Then the world's wrong." Something inside her broke then, the dam of years spent believing she wasn't worth defending. Tears fell freely, and Colt pulled her into his arms, her sobs shaking against his chest. The world outside their small cabin was still cruel, still whispering, still watching. But in that moment, with his arms around her and the scent of hay and rain in the air, she felt safe. Truly safe. Days later, a letter arrived from the sheriff himself, a summons. The town council wanted to discuss Colt's behavior at the store, claiming he'd threatened good citizens. Colt read it in silence, then burned it in the stove. "Ain't their business how I treat my wife," he said simply. But Mary saw the strain in his eyes. He was tired of fighting ghosts and gossip. That evening, when they went to bed, she turned to him and whispered, "You could have had an easier life, Colt. You didn't have to choose me." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes dark and steady in the dim lamplight. "Maybe not," he said finally, "but I needed to." And though she didn't fully understand what he meant, she reached for his hand beneath the covers, her fingers fitting against his scarred knuckles. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the town's laughter, the whispers, the cruel jokes. But for once, she didn't care, because inside that small worn cabin, a man who'd seen through her shame was holding her hand as though it were the most precious thing he'd ever touched. And somehow, that was enough. The spring fair came like every other year, though for Mary it might as well have been the trial of her soul. The whole town had gathered, music rising over the dust and laughter spilling like a current through the square. She hadn't wanted to go. She'd told Colt that standing by the corral fence with her hands trembling. But he'd simply smiled, that quiet smile that always seemed to steady her storms. "You've hidden long enough," he'd said softly. "They don't own your story anymore." He held out his hand, and though her heart pounded like thunder under her ribs, she took it. When they rode into town together, heads turned like a wave, whispers crawling through the crowd. But Colt didn't flinch, didn't break stride. His hand stayed firm around hers, as if he were daring anyone to speak first. They dismounted near the old well, where months ago, men had spat and laughed as they'd called her names she couldn't forget. Mary felt that old fear rising again, the ache of being seen and despised, but Colt leaned close and said, "They can only laugh if you bow. Stand tall, Mary," and she did. Slowly she straightened, brushing the dust from her skirt, feeling the sun on her face. For the first time she looked at them, not through shame but through something like defiance. Some of the men looked away, some smirked. But the women, especially the older ones, seemed to soften as if remembering wounds of their own. It was strange how one small act of standing up could shift the air around her. They entered the hall together. The sheriff spotted them first, his grin wide and awkward like a man realizing too late what he'd once made a joke of. "Well, look who's come back," he said too loudly, trying to turn it into something good-natured. Colt didn't answer. He just looked at him, steady, unreadable, that silent authority that came from a man who worked and bled more than he spoke. The sheriff swallowed hard and muttered something about drinks. When they passed, conversations faltered. Mary could feel the eyes, the measuring, the quiet sting of judgment. But beneath it all was curiosity, too. Maybe they'd expected her to have broken by now. Maybe they'd never expected to see her walk so sure beside a man like Colt. Later that evening, a group of men began to whisper near the barrels. One of them, a ranch hand named Luke, said loud enough for all to hear, "Guess the cowboy liked a challenge. Or maybe he just wanted someone too big to run away." The laughter that followed was sharp as glass. Colt turned slowly, his face calm, his eyes colder than steel. He walked toward Luke, and every step seemed to press silence over the crowd. When he reached him, he didn't draw his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "You think you know strength? You don't know what it is to work beside someone who never quits. You don't know what it means to love someone who's been spat on and still stands tall." Luke opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Colt stepped closer. "This woman," he said, turning so everyone could hear, Has more courage than any man here who's ever hidden behind a laugh." The hall went still. Even the band stopped playing, and in that quiet something inside Mary cracked open. Not from pain this time, but from awe. He wasn't defending her because he pitied her. He was honoring her. He saw her, truly saw her, and somehow that hurt more beautifully than any kindness she'd ever known. She felt tears rise not from sadness but from the shock of finally being enough. When they left the hall, no one laughed. The sheriff took off his hat as they passed. A few women nodded almost shyly as if they too understood now. The night air was cool, the moon hanging low, silvering the dust. Mary felt lightheaded, half afraid she'd wake and find it all undone. But Colt's arm came around her shoulders, grounding her. "You did that," he said, "not me. You walked in there and faced them." She shook her head, smiling through tears. "No, Colt. You believed in me before I could." He brushed a thumb over her cheek, and for once she didn't pull away. The following months changed everything quietly. No one spoke cruelly to her again, at least not where others could hear. Word spread of her skill, her bread, her needlework, the way she could calm even the wildest colt. The same men who'd laughed now tipped their hats. The same women who'd whispered came to her door for recipes, advice, company. Mary never forgot the past, but she stopped letting it poison her mornings. The shame that once wrapped her like chains began to feel like something distant, a scar that no longer bled. One evening, as summer gave way to the gold of early autumn, she stood on the porch watching the horizon burn with sunset. Colt came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think love was something you had to earn. But you taught me it's something you build, slow, steady, with your hands in the dirt." She leaned back against him, smiling. "And I thought love wasn't meant for someone like me," she whispered. "But maybe I just hadn't met a man brave enough to see it." They stood like that for a long while, watching the last of the light fade over their land. The wind carried the sound of cattle lowing, the hum of crickets, the quiet heartbeat of a life they'd built out of scorn and turned into something sacred. Mary felt no need to hide anymore. Her body, once a target of mockery, now felt like home, a home someone cherished, a home she finally belonged in. Years later, people would still talk about that day at the fair, how the cowboy who could have had anyone chose the woman everyone ridiculed, and how that choice changed the way the town saw beauty, courage, and love. But for Mary and Colt, it was never about proving anything. It was about surviving long enough to be seen, and about finding that love, when it's true, doesn't ask you to become someone else. It just stays quiet, steady, like a man's hand that never lets go. And on that porch, as the stars bloomed over the wide western sky, Mary finally whispered the words she'd carried for so long. "Thank you for choosing me." Colt smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Darlin'," he said, "I didn't choose you. I just found what I'd been looking for my whole life." And the night wrapped around them, gentle and endless, like forgiveness itself.